tonight's dialogue is educational justice, policy and legal issues impacting African American students. And it is co-sponsored, as all of these community dialogue sessions have been, by the LMU Doctoral program and the LMU Family of Schools, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is the 10th anniversary of our doctoral program. We now have over 100 alumni who are making a great difference in education and community services throughout the great state of California and all the way to Boston, where a recent alum, Dr. Connie Chang, who's been at LAUSD, was named superintendent of Boston Public Schools. And we are very happy about that. And tonight we have two panelists who are alum of the program, Dr. Angela Bass and Dr. Carla McCullough, and we will have a full introduction of them as we move on here. One announcement I'd like to make is that our annual doctoral program symposium will be held this year on April 30th from 6 until 8 p.m. in University Hall 1857. So please see our doctoral program website for more details on that and to our SVP. And finally, I want to give a grateful acknowledgement to our administrative program coordinator, Dr. Deanna Pittman, who has been very large in logistics and far more than that, as well as the person I'm about to introduce to you, Darren Early, who is the director of the LMU Family of Schools. So again, welcome from me, and I now am happy to turn it over to Darren.
Hi, everyone. Hi. We're out here tonight. Hi, everyone. Hi. All right. We are so excited. This has been a wonderful year. I think that Dr. Rose said it best, and then he kind of let it taper off a little bit. But the brain behind this whole machine, I would say, is Deanna Pittman. And right now, we need to be sure. And then the logistical side, she's killed it. All right, everything with it, always done. Is this our fifth? This is our fifth community dialogue of this school year, and as we looked at African American students and just a variety of topics. Our first topic was social and cultural and identity, emotional and identity development. Our second topic, we dealt with culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Then we had an interim where we had Dr. Carol Brunson-Day, who came in and had conversations with us surrounding the Moynihan report for years we visited. And that was amazing. That was part of our, let me say this correctly. That was part of our, not presidential, help me out please, Dean. Our Levy lecture series. Thank you. I have all these lecture series in my brain. So it was part of our Levy lecture series. And that was just outstanding. Then afterwards, our last panel discussion addressed African American students and higher education. And then today, I think our conversation is probably the most important of all those conversations because I didn't know this and I had to learn this as and I'm speaking more so to our students now. As a practitioner, we get in the classroom, we do our work with younger students, and we're just so excited. But what drives a lot of the work we do is policy, and sometimes we ignore it when we shouldn't. And today is a conversation that is going to be really rich, and we're going to have a discussion about education policy as it relates to African American students, as it relates to building educational justice. So we're really, really excited about that. We have more announcements when we get done, but right now it is my pleasure to, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself and also to introduce the rest of our panelists tonight. Our moderator is Jeff Rodriguez, and he is just a great guy, a great friend of LMU. Come on up, please, bro.
To be that tall someday. Thank you so much. I always say this when I'm at LMU, speaking in front of students. This university changed my life. I came as an undergraduate here a few years ago. And it's the reason I do the work that I do today is because of the social justice underpinnings the Jesuit tradition, the Marymount tradition, but also because of professors like Dr. Shane Martin, our dean here. As I always say, Ed reform in Los Angeles, you just got to scratch the surface and you're going to find Shane Martin in there somewhere. He is behind everything that moves in this city and this district, and we're just so fortunate to have him as our leader here. So tonight, we have an opportunity to have a dialogue with some amazing individuals, but also with you all around a very important issue, which is this issue of policy around African American students in terms of getting to equity and access and success for that matter. So let me start off with a quick quote, and then I'll introduce our panel members. So if we, this is by Dr. Asa Hitler, when we choose excellent performance as the goal, academically and socially, we change the teaching and learning paradigm in fundamental ways. By setting the required performance level at excellence, we require excellent performance to be articulated. And this is important for us because we keep talking about the achievement gap. The achievement gap and the achievement gap, that is the highest performing kids and those kids that don't perform that well. The truth is we have an excellence gap in this country. And we should be talking about excellence because as we then go off and educate our young people, what we really should be comparing them to is how our kids are doing internationally. How all of our students, even our highest performers, are not doing very well when you think about their international counterparts. And so then the achievement gap and the excellence gap becomes even more and more wide for certain students. Students of color, students of low socioeconomic means, first-generation students. And so this is an important dialogue for us to have, particularly as we have a district in Los Angeles that has become more and more Latino. That means that we're paying a lot of attention to Latino kids, as we should. However, that means that we're also then not paying attention specifically to certain types of kids. And as the quote that I just read, if we don't articulate excellence, then we can't perform and see it. If we don't articulate the needs of our African American students, then we're not going to be able to see and meet them as well. And so we have a great panel today. We're very lucky to have members of this community who are experts in their own right, but also able to talk about this very particular issue. So I want to bring up Dr. Angela Bass, who is an alum of And I will say a few words about Dr. Bass, and then we're going to allow all of the panel members to contextualize their work around this topic. Dr. Bass is the Vice President at PUC Schools. She leads our Leadership for Excellence, Accountability, and Diversity work, which aims to promote leadership among people of color in our schools to lead high-performing schools. And this partnership is with LMU, with PUC Schools, as well as LA Unified. She brings charter leaders together with traditional school leaders together to build a robust pipeline of leaders of color. I also want to welcome Dr. Carla McCullough, who is the Assistant Principal at the Alliance College. And I will let Dr. McCullough tell a little bit more about her work, but she, beyond holding the doctorate from LMU, she holds a bachelor's degree in drama and political science from Spelman College, and she received her teaching credential and master's from LMU, and also now holds her doctorate. So she's an LMU through and through. And lastly, I want to, of course, bring up our Dean, Dr. Shane P. Martin, who needs no further who needs his own way. See? So the first question I'm going to ask all of you is to share with the audience what your own, contextualize your own professional work and your own development professionally around this topic of policy for excellence for African American students. So, Dr. Bass, if you don't mind.
Sure. I first want to make a true acknowledgement. We can't heal or fix or improve anything that we don't acknowledge. And the fact that Loyola Marymount has taken the time to have these sets of events and discussions so that we can talk about the achievement of African American children in our schools in this country is significant. Many places it's not being spoken about. So I need to thank you and the committee who kind of came up with the conception to do this. It's so important. I began my career, actually, I was a college student at San Francisco State, and I taught preschool for 2 years with the United Way program. And what makes that so significant now is that, number one, it paid my way through college, but more importantly, I got to see children at the earliest beginnings of learning, and to see the kind of bright and resilient faces that come in the door. And we'll talk about that later. I taught a year in Kansas City, in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, and then for 30 years, I was an educator in San Diego Unified Schools. I share that San Diego was a very diverse community, and I had the privilege to serve as a teacher, a race and relations facilitator, and a school administrator in our lowest performing schools in San Diego, but I also had the privilege of working in our highest performing, and then schools where there was this great diversity in the schools. I went on to become instructional leader, area superintendent, and then got asked by Rick Martinez to come to Los Angeles to serve with the mayor through the Mayor's Partnership for Los Angeles Schools in 2008, where I served as superintendent of instruction for 22 of the lowest performing schools in the state of California, and they were in lowest 5% performance in Los Angeles. At the last 4 years, I have been working with partners in PUC, and what I discovered, and we'll talk soon, is been able to work with school leaders. One of the things you will know is that when you see a great school, you will see a great leader. Regardless of the ethnicity of our children, or because of the diversity of our children, it is critical to have a diverse, a principal who is a principal of excellence, who really knows how to work with a broad spectrum in communities. So when we began to talk about policies in our communities, it is so important for you, if you're a teacher, or if you're a parent, or even if you're a leader, examination of who you are and how you treat and receive every child in your school and your school community is critical. There were equity and access problems between my lowest performing. My first experience was in a community called Tierra as a teacher, and there were 2 African American teachers, and there were probably 10 African American children in that school. And even with the small population of African American children, my other teacher colleague and I ended up becoming the shelter and the advocate for the families of those children, because even in that experience where you could be seen as the exception, many of the children, mostly our males, were targeted, and there were, as you know, suspensions, called out, sit in the office, sit out in the hallway. And that was in 1979. All the way through to my experiences in the lowest performing schools, we had the same situations going, but the numbers were exponential. But I'll tell you one thing that I knew from the beginning is when you have high quality teachers and high quality expectations and a mindset that all of our children are brilliant, great things will happen. And so I think your policy is, how do you pick the right people? How do you have the right kind of mindset? And then how do we begin to put our vision and our thoughts into action to really serve? And when we say all children, we don't give the proverbial all. We can tell you about African American children, we can tell you about Latino children, we can tell you about our Asian children, our white students, and that we want excellence for all of our children.
Thank you. Dr. McCullough.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you again to Shane for having us here. So I want to start out by talking about my love of history. I am a lover of history, and I think it's extremely important, especially when you are dealing with young minds, that you understand the history of the community and you understand the history of everything that you're dealing with so you can know how to move forward. So I'm going to give you my brief history, which also correlates overall to educational policy. So I'm from Chicago, Illinois, born and raised. And I remember distinctly being 4 years old and walking up a long staircase to go take a test, not really knowing what the test was, but I did learn that I did well, and I got into a magnet school. So from age 5 all the way to 4th grade, I walked to my local elementary, and instead of going into the local elementary, which, if you know anything about Chicago, in some ways it's segregated. So instead of going to that local elementary, I got on the yellow school bus, which drove me to a different neighborhood to go to that magnet program. So after leaving that experience in middle school, I went to an all African American middle school setting, which was a Christian school. So I had that experience going on. And then in high school, different experience, went to a school that was majority white, a Catholic school, had to take 4 buses, walk a mile, sometimes in the snow, if you know anything about Chicago snow, to get there. But my mother was adamant that I want you to have a better education, and better did equal, in part, the money piece and the parochial piece, but also a little bit about the race, a different neighborhood, that kind of thing. Then my journey took me to Atlanta to a historically black college, which was Spelman College, which was an amazing experience. But again, I want to bring all those pieces up to then talk about policy. So I joined Teach for America while at Spelman, got my first choice, which was Los Angeles, came here sight unseen, and began my tour teaching at Gompers Middle School, which is in very close to the Watts area, which is where I met Dr. Bass, which was a great experience. Spent 9 years working there as a teacher, a counselor, sometimes a parent. They used to call me Mom McCullough, and that is the kind of community that we had. Also as a dean of discipline, and then took that experience, and then from there became an assistant principal and now a principal. In that time, I spent a lot of time here at LMU, as you mentioned, and ended up working on my dissertation, which looked at Brown versus Board of Education, and really looked at the unintended consequences. And the reason I bring up the historical piece is because some of those unintended consequences of Brown, when we're talking about policy, are exactly what I experienced. The magnet schools that took you out of your community, took you to a completely different community where a lot of times your parents were not able to get to where the school was. So the parent-school connection was not there. Again, taking public transportation to different neighborhoods to go to high school. And it was just the policy had a lot of unintended consequences, and I think we're going to discuss a little bit more in some of the other questions, but that is how I got to be where I am, and that is why I strongly believe that it's, again, important to look at the historical side of everything and really also understand policy.
Dr. Martin.
Well, thank you, and it's terrific to have everybody here. Thanks so much for coming out. I want to acknowledge Ref Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez, who's just been a longtime collaborator with us at LMU, and of course, both Dr. Bass and Dr. McCullough. It's a privilege to be on this panel with you. Can everyone hear okay? Is this loud enough, everybody? No, not. Okay, so we'll do maybe our, you know what, this isn't even on. That's the problem.
There you go.
Okay, we'll do it this way. Maybe, is that a little better in the back? Okay, thank you. Again, it's just great to be here with all of you. Thanks for turning out this afternoon. You know, this series is so important, and I'm really glad that the School of Ed, in co-sponsorship with a lot of our partners, have been able to have this series because, as Ref said, we don't talk enough about some of these issues. We often don't talk enough about our African American students. So a little bit on my own background and history. I'm a native of Los Angeles, grew up in LA area, right in the Alhambra, San Gabriel Valley. I'm a graduate of Loyola Marymount University, graduated in 1980. The place looked a little bit different back then. We didn't have University Hall, we didn't have all of this. And I became an educator. And in part I became an educator because I truly believed that it's an opportunity not just to make a difference with people right in front of you, but in fact there's what I call a multiplier effect. And what I mean by that is if you influence people who in turn influence others, there can be a bigger effective change. And I think that's so important. I've been at LMU many years. I'm in my 20th year here. I've been in the dean's role for about a decade. It's been a great privilege to work with such wonderful colleagues. But I also wear another hat that I think speaks to what we're talking about tonight. And I also sit as a policymaker for a state commission in California, which is the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. The state commission that oversees the licensing of teachers, principals, counselors, and also creates the standards for accreditation. I should also mention that Dr. Rodriguez is a commissioner on the same commission, so we both get that great privilege. And you know, going up to Sacramento about once a month and sitting in a public state commission and watching and being part of shaping policy around education that affects what happens for kids every day is truly a great experience. And I'll have a lot of stories to share about that. But that's a little bit about my background that I bring to the conversation.
And why don't we continue, hold holding the microphone. So I want to know, based on where you sit now and the work that you're doing now, what do the terms equity and access mean to you?
One of the basic things we talk about in the School of Education is the difference between equity and equality. And they're slightly different standards. You know, one reading of a lot of the founding documents of the United States is about equality, that this country and the principles behind this country is all about equality. Of course, though, when you read those founding documents that say all men are created equal, right away there's a clue that not everybody really, you know, equal was interpreted in historical context. It didn't involve women and really only involved white men who owned property. So there's some real challenges even in the way that we look at that. Equity is just a much more profound way to look at justice. Equity truly means that we're committed to ensuring that everyone has what they need to be successful and to be a full human being, a full person. Understanding that it may be different, in fact, may not be equal. You know, equality is an agreement that everyone will get exactly the same opportunity, the same chance. Equity says, you know, not everybody necessarily starts from the same place, and therefore, to be successful, which is the goal that we want for everyone, we have to look at a higher standard, if you will. And ultimately, it's about access. How do people have access to success, access to their dreams, access to a future? We can't take it for granted that that's true the same way for all of our children.
Dr. McCullough, what about for you, where you sit now?
I want to share one example around access. So I gave you my background in terms of my K through 12 education. And so now that I'm principal of a high school, I reflect a lot back on my own high school experience. And there's one difference there's a lot of differences that stand out to me, but there's one that stand out to me in this particular instance. In 10th grade, I distinctly remember being able to take the PSAT as a practice, because in 11th grade, when you took the PSAT, then you were going to have access to money for National Merit Scholarship. And I look around at some inner city high schools, and the PSAT, while it is offered in 11th grade, it's offered almost as a, we have to take this test, this is what we're doing. There's no background information given. Students have no practice. Sometimes they're taking other tests in 9th and 10th grade that they've taken before, as opposed to really having access to that money and those particular things. And I think there's a correlation there with also access to the kind of education that will allow them to be competitive with students that are not only in their same community, but students that are in other communities and students that are around the world as well. And so that's just one small example of one small, tiny policy even here within Los Angeles that would really, if we looked at making shifts, would change the access for students.
Dr. Bass?
Just to agree with both Shane and Carla, you know, equity is really about making sure that the needs of particular children in all of our schools are met. It doesn't mean the same as Shane talked about. So if you're in one community and your children come with particular needs, complex needs, that doesn't mean you're going to get the same. You can put a book, Houghton Mifflin book in one school and a Houghton Mifflin book in the other, but that doesn't mean that you have equity. I think the supports are based on who our children are, and the context in which your children come to school are really, really important. And a lot of people think, well, you already have the books, you have the same books we have, but there are other needs that our youth need, and we need to make sure that if there's more. And an analogy for that would be if we had, a classroom full of children, and some of them had a really bad infection, we might give them an antibiotic. And others just didn't have it quite as bad, we'd give them a Bayer aspirin. We have to make sure what we're trying to do to support our youth really meets their specific needs. And I think the question of access, once you give children access, we have access to an A to G curriculum. But when the kids get there, the teachers don't know how to teach the lesson, or there aren't materials, or there's not tutorial to help improve their skills, then do they really have access? They're in a room that's A to G, you got that course, right? But if they don't have the supports to make sure that they're successful, then we haven't accomplished access. We've just kind of put them in a room and said, you're in an A to G course of study, but we've left our children hanging there. And sometimes we've left our teachers hanging because they need to be equipped, and are they prepared with professional development and professional learning experiences that help them. So I think we really do need to shift away from equality, because this is not about equality. We can go into 10 different communities in Los Angeles and there will be 10 different sets of needs. And so really think about not the same, but think about who are our children, what do they need, and how do we provide that, and how once we give them access to high quality, making sure the resources and the teachers' knowledge and the students and their families have enough so that we can make sure that they're successful.
Thank you. And that actually is in line with the next question around, so kids don't all start at the same place. Are there policies and practices that are racist that keep our kids from starting on equal playing fields? And so based on your experiences, what are some of the systemic inequities and barriers that those policies and practices have created for particularly African American students?
I'd say there's probably a lot of practices. Having said that, I think we have to go back further. I think that, you know, in early times, right when the Constitution was signed, we had families in 1787, black families in Boston, who said, I just want my children in Massachusetts Bay, I just want my children to have a quality education. As Carla talked about Brown versus the Board of Education, we can even talk about the Lemon Grove incident. I think that our nation has been well-intended in putting policies in place that is trying to improve the quality of education. But the practices and the implementation of those things have been racist. I think that we haven't provided a fair opportunity. Even when the Coleman report, and I hope that you read that, it's a 1965 report, and you might think it's boring, but it's a very significant point where they were saying, you know what, just by putting a white child next to an African-American child or a Latino child, the education is not going to be that much better. We need to improve the quality of teacher practice. We need to improve the quality of the schools where our children are, and we can get there. Then we went to a nation at risk. So we told everybody that our nation is at risk, and yet every policy that we put in place, we haven't made good on the promise. NCLB, all of you know, by what, 14, all children will be proficient. How are we doing? How are we doing? We do have a lot of policies. We have to be careful that we don't think, you know, these are well intended, but they've had unintended consequences for children. As a matter of fact, if we looked at the data, in African American children in the United States, 15% of all the children in the United States public schools are African American. 15%, 7.9 million. How are the African American children doing across this country? I work in New Orleans. 19% of all the children, 2nd grade through 11th, are proficient in literacy. So we have to look at why is that so? Because we have policy, but what are the practices? What are the practices that we put in place? What's the mindset? What's the intention? I think there are a lot of great people who want all of our children to succeed, but have we put in the proper supports? Have we conveyed the proper urgency? And do we love our kids? Do we love our kids to sit and allow only 19%? Nationwide, our 4th grade students and on the NAEP and 8th grade students, African American students, are less than 39%. So it's not because our children aren't brilliant, but I do think it's because we have to move beyond policy to begin to look at practices that demonstrate that we do care and that we can care. And I will say, there are schools across LA and this nation where 99% of the African American children are proficient in advanced. So please don't mistake that it's not happening. We need to call those places out, and we need to see what's going on in those schools, and we need to bring those practices back to our other communities.
So what about some of those systemic inequities and barriers? I don't want to take the thought from your head, but also I want to make sure to think that.
Okay, so I'll think about that. I'll keep that, and then I want to go back to the comment about students being proficient in advance and us looking at different policies. So you all are all aware that we now have a new testing system, right? So we know Common Core and the way that it's tested. We also know that it is not just a pen and paper test. Now it is computerized. And so just this week, we're having a week of testing. So I can give you real world examples of students who are testing in math, but really it seems like they're testing in computer literacy. And if you are looking at inner city schools where the electives have been cut and you don't have a computer or a typing class, and the test is asking you a math question, but you need to click and type and know which shift to hold down to get the multiplication. So what are we being tested on? So if we look at the policy and the practice piece, there is a disconnect. And so I think it's very important first off, it's very important for policymakers to look at everybody that we're making the policy for, not just a select few. And I think as a part of this conversation, we also need to be looking at the socioeconomic piece as well, because if you don't have a computer in the home, and you only just now got your iPad last semester, and now you're really learning how to use it, but this is what you're being tested on, and this is what will be used to put you in your course for next year. So the proficient and advanced, that I think that has completely changed.
See how brilliant you were? You did talk about sustainability.
So I have actually sort of three things that come to mind. I'll try to touch on them briefly around this issue of policies that end up being racist, whether they're intended to be or not. So in many of our major urban core areas in the United States, if you go into middle schools and particularly high schools, in many of our urban areas, you actually think you're walking into a prison complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because first of all, you're going to go through a metal detector.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're going to see guards, often armed, everywhere. You're going to see an environment that actually looks much more like some type of a detention center than an educational environment that really, really means to bring the best out of everyone. You don't see that in other parts of the country and other parts of those cities. So you really have a tale of two cities. And I think there's a lot of things that are behind that belief system, but it sort of leads me to the second policy area. It has to do with school finances. And I think we have a real problem with the way we finance public education in the United States. And it leads to practices that I think play out in ways that could be viewed as racist. We primarily fund public education through property taxes. And of course, if you live in a particular community that has the affluence, then your public school, your local school is going to reflect that. And other communities that have the ability have all kind of fundraisers and all kind of extra booster clubs and things to even bring in more money. So that's a problem in a country like the United States, where we claim to be the type of democracy that says everyone has a fair shot, however you define fair, whether you come down on the equality or equity side, but a fair shot at moving forward. And a rationale for funding public education is to ensure that regardless of the accident of birth in a privileged or less privileged home or community, everyone will go through that same excellent public school experience and have the opportunity to grow and become whatever he or she wants to be. But it turns out we don't provide that to children. We provide them very, very different experiences. And part of that ties to funding. And then a third area that is just very, very specific that's often on my mind has to do with the way we interact with young people around school culture, around discipline. This plays out in expulsion, and this plays out in all of these suspensions, all these kinds of things. I'm very concerned specifically about the overrepresentation of our African American students, especially African American males, with higher rates of suspension or expulsion, and in particular, higher rates of being identified as students who need special education services. And I think there's some patterns here. There's been some good research on this that Alfredo Artiles has done and some others. And this isn't just for African American males. Also, this is true for students who don't speak English as a first language, for many of our English learners. So it picks up a lot of our Latino and other students of color. But too often, where there's students who teachers say, these folks aren't easy, quote unquote, for me to deal with. So I'll identify them and send them to another part of the institution. And I think those are racist policies.
Thank you. I mean, that's, I often say that as a society, we tend to not value our young people, period. Right? And a lot of what we talked about, three of you talked about, is manifested in our school system. And so it's really interesting that we're having this discussion now. I also want to alert you that we'll have an opportunity to do a question and answer in about 15 minutes or so. So if you have questions, please jot them down and you'll have an opportunity to ask them of the panel members. So let's talk about the issues around suspensions and expulsions and the correlation of the school prison pipeline, particularly with African American kids. An African American boy who is suspended is more likely then to enter prison than to enter college, and that is just a fact. And so what are some of the barriers that we're seeing around that? What are some of the mindsets that we're seeing around why we're expelling and suspending particularly African American low-income kids? And then secondly, if we've got some ideas around, so what can be done to curtail that? And there's some great things the district is doing now, but in your opinion, from where you sit, what are some good things that can be done to stop this practice?
Okay, so I was a dean of discipline for 4.5 years. So my only job was suspension, expulsion, detention, so forth and so on. And I tell this story at the school site that I work at now, and I tell my staff very honestly, this is Fantasy Island. And they look at me like how you all are looking at me now. Well, what do you mean this is Fantasy Island? Well, when I was a dean, I saw between 75 and 100 students a day in a school of about, at that time, maybe 1,500 students. And I know this because we kept logs and we kept very meticulous numbers. There were some serious discipline issues, some fights and that kind of thing, but if you think about between an average of 75 to 100 students a day, the majority of that stuff was Johnny wouldn't sit down, Sarah wouldn't shut up, so-and-so didn't have a pencil, so forth and so on. So in terms of, and then it would escalate to other things. So in terms of ways that we can change that and ways that I see now at my current school site that we do things differently, Johnny doesn't have a pencil, here you go. Johnny won't sit down. Okay, it doesn't have to be a yelling match. It doesn't have to be me against you, particularly when we're talking about African American males. Sometimes it's understanding that the easiest way to go about something is to get quieter, not louder. And so that's a very simple shift that individuals can make, but there have to be conversations, there has to be training about. Also, for the when you're looking at middle school and high school, you're also dealing with teenagers, and we all have been teenagers, so we know how we were. Right. So a lot of that has nothing to do with color. That is the age that they're in. So there are certain things that we need to shift within ourselves, but that comes into leadership as well in terms of training for how to do those things. So.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like us to think about reframing how we see African American children, period. I think that one of the things that we have neglected to do in this country, in this whole concept of salad bowl and melting pot, we have misidentified or disconnected our children from who they are and where they're from. And if you don't know, as a teacher, as a parent, you know, African children come from the very first university on earth, in Kemet. They come from a community of scholars. But what we've done is we've created a narrative in this country that our children we began in slavery as Black people, but that's so far from the truth. So how you see your children, what they know about themselves and what we as teachers and educators know about the culture and the race of our children really is a determiner. If you already think they're poor, broke down, Black, loud, whatever those things are, then that's going to follow a prophecy within your classroom. But I think we need to go back and re-educate ourselves about who we are, whether you're African American, and what did that look like in Kemet, the first university, and who were the great scholars.
Scholarship didn't come from Greece. They went over to Africa and found a ticket back to Greece. So we need to tell the truth about the story about African people and then transfer that knowledge to our schools and our communities and to our children. We also need to make sure we understand the cultural nuances. You know, a lot of our work around the racist practices is our mindset. I heard an example that 2 days ago, or no, last Saturday. Child walks in, he walks 1.5 miles to get to school. He has to navigate a community that has multiple gangs in, so you gotta get there safe. He walks in the door, his hat's on backward, and the very first thing the teacher says, take that hat off. So you're talking about an African American male who's already got stressors in his life, or her life, and then you tell him to take it off, All the other children are looking. What are the odds that he's gonna take that hat off at the very beginning? So how you treat someone, you're gonna get that response. If I said that to you, there'd be some kind of attitude, right? What do you mean? So the child gets to, he's up, take my hat off. She points and sends him out the door. He gets suspended. He's on the street. The cops are there because he's out about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And guess what? School's supposed to be on. He gets sent to juvenile hall. He has his introduction to the pipeline. I think we have to think about the consequence. We need to know who our children are. We need to know the experiences that they come from. What Carla tells you about how many children she supported at Gompers, what she didn't tell you is that 40% of those children came from foster homes. So you're talking about kids coming to school, they don't even know who their parents are. They're living with other people. She would tell you that she got up every morning and got there at 5 o'clock, and she picked up a child like I know about Cheyenne, and she brought Cheyenne to school every day because if she didn't go pick her up and take her home,
Cheyenne wasn't coming to school. So it's about not only children possessing kind of grit, it's about us knowing who they are, knowing their stories, knowing their narratives, and having an appreciation because they're living with a lot. They can overcome it, but we have to understand it. We can't just think that it's, oh, they're coming in here with their hat on backwards. It's bigger than that. It's deeper than that. And when you tell children they're great and they come from greatness, and when you tell children they're brilliant, boy, do you know you are brilliant? Watch their faces. Just go back to your places tomorrow and think you're brilliant. You will change the DNA of how a child sees him or herself. And we've got to begin to change the narrative and tell the real story. Tell the real story. Ref knows where his family comes from. He knows every bit about his generational family. That's why he has personal agency. Our children walk around and they're confused. They're confused because they don't know who they are. And I think as educators, we need to make sure we are coming equipped with knowledge, not to stereotype, but to demonstrate that greatness for every culture, and then begin to teach into that and teach who those children are as individuals.
Dr. Martin, could I ask you to expand on that particular statement, or those statements that Angela made around culturally relevant pedagogy? And LMU's been a leader in this, has been doing it before it was cool. But in terms of how does it fit currently, particularly in policy, and what are some of the areas that you see growth in terms of this type of practice and pedagogy?
Well, I really am an optimist, and I believe in hope, and I believe that overall we're moving forward. But I have to admit that there's times where I scratch my head. I've been involved in education for well over 3 decades, and I'd like to think that in 2015 we're a little farther ahead than we are. When I started my own professional work in master's studies and doctoral studies, I was very interested in cultural diversity, multicultural education. And this was the 1970s, 1980s. We've gone through the 1960s and those social movements in our country, and now we're trying to figure out how do we bring what we learned in the 1960s into the curriculum, because there was a fundamental belief that every child needs to see herself somewhere in the school. And so children who go to school and don't connect with a teacher, don't see themselves in the curriculum, in the stories, in the history, who don't see anyone that looks like them in the teaching force, or on the pictures that we put up in the wall and say these are the important people, that child is very much at risk to fall through the cracks, to not be connected to that school, because what's going to connect that child? Not being in a club or an activity. And I see that we still are in an environment where there's too much of that. The whole idea behind culturally responsive pedagogy builds very much on what Dr. Bass talked about. Teachers, educators, principals, we need to know our students, and we need to know, understand, and appreciate and respect the communities they come from. And look at all of our students in a positive way rather than any type of a deficit way. And so for too long in our history, we've looked at some students who might live in the circumstances of poverty, who might come from a community that is struggling with different issues, has a higher crime rate than another community, as Angela said, as poor, broken children. More often than not, those are children of color. Those are first-generation students. Those are students who are living in poverty. I think that's a real mistake. But teachers who don't understand the great gifts and the strengths and the funds of knowledge that those communities have aren't going to be able to understand this. So culturally responsive pedagogy is very much how to build the bridge between the school and the home culture, realizing that there's a lot to learn in the informal pedagogy of the home. And in fact, in many cases, families that are struggling with a whole array of challenges that we just talked about have a greater depth of knowledge of just how to make it work in families that have so much privilege. And children that are socialized in those families and those communities come to school with a great wealth, but it doesn't show up often in the formal curriculum. So they know all kinds of stuff on the streets and in the community, but have no ability to demonstrate that knowledge in the formal curriculum because there's such a disconnect between what we say is, the value of the formal curriculum, the book learning, and what children bring from home. And so our children are rich in cultural knowledge, in funds of knowledge, in household knowledge, in community knowledge. And if teachers don't have the ability to see this and find ways in the curriculum for them to demonstrate that, it's too easy for those children to fall through the cracks. So on another level, cultural responsive pedagogy, at a very simple level, means, what's the explicit curriculum and what's the hidden curriculum? The hidden curriculum, the explicit curriculum is this is all the things we say we're going to do. It's all the authors on the reading list, the syllabus, all of these things. The hidden curriculum are all those things that, in fact, we don't necessarily talk about, but they're not lost on our kids. So when they're in advanced placement literature and all of the authors they're reading are from one particular perspective, often a Western perspective, they're all white males, The hidden curriculum says to students, the other voices really aren't as important. And so teachers who are thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy are adjusting for that. And too often, although we've made some strides in this, we're still not there. The curriculum still very much is tied to the dominant culture. And we've got to open it up a lot more. So those are just some thoughts about culturally responsive pedagogy.
And I'd love to hear from Dr. McCullough. So what do you do at your schoolhouse around ensuring that some of these practices are at least being thought of by your staff as they're affecting kids?
Well, I think first things first is really just about being kind, which is not policy, but it's just a practice. So we start first thing in the morning. I'm out at 7:15, and not just me, but everyone on our supervision staff, and we're shaking hands. Good morning, how are you? Good to see you. So good to see you this morning, right? And even if you got in trouble yesterday or there was something, you always start first thing in the morning with a kind word, regardless of what is going on. And so the same thing starts in the classroom. So then they go to class, the teacher's at the door, good morning, how are you, so good to see you. And so we can really, then we start out from this place of openness and kindness, and so everything else is easy. And so students are able to have conversations about, I'm really interested in this, so what do you think about this? And then that book can show up in the curriculum. Students can come to me as principal and say, well, I really think maybe we need to do this and talk about this, and we can have that dialogue, and then we can make it work there at the school. So it's really first about just being kind. And so that translates into the classroom and it goes.
Dr. Basson, this is going to be the last question, and I do want all three of you to answer this before we get into our Q&A. This is a great question. What is the role and responsibility of policymakers and district and school leaders to promote educational justice? And the second part is, what is the role and the responsibility of the community influencing or demanding policies that promote social justice? You can take both questions or one.
I think they do go hand in hand. I think that number one, both the district leaders from the top to the principals to students and teachers, they all have to believe that our children can learn, and we have to begin to equip these schools with the right amount of resources and the right kind of people in the schools. If you go to a school and today's society, we're not going to have the largest number of African American teachers on our campus. But there are other staff people, there are other community people that can come into the school and be the models. One of the things that I do is my community work is we mentor at one of the schools in San Diego called San Diego High School. This school has 700 students. 520 are Latino and 158 or so are African American. There's one, and he's a custodian, one African American person on that campus. One of the things the principal said to me, she said, I don't know what to do. My achievement of my African American students is at 3%. Angela, can you help? And what we began to do is we talked to the students, and we talked with the teachers, and we created a mentoring program. 1 year later, there are 67 students in the program, both African American and Latino, and we have about 42 mentors. So we're bringing in people. So policy, sometimes you have to go without the policy. We didn't start with the superintendent on this. A principal asked for help, and we used our collective knowledge to go out into the community and recruit people on a volunteer basis. I think we have to begin to understand the kind of old African proverb that says, I am because we are, therefore I am. It is the smart thing to do as policymakers, educators, to make sure that we are all in this together and that we're doing this work together. It can't be done by ourselves. So it should be the #1 issue. If you're a politician, it should be your #1 issue to talk about why are not all children learning, not just some. One of the statistical things that happens today, because the numbers of African American children are declining in urban cities, is that the numbers are not statistically reported because it's less than 100. So if you have a school, if you have less than 100 black kids, guess what they say? They don't have any statistics on that. But we do. We do have statistics on that. So as a leader, we have to say, well, you only have 7. How are those 7 doing? How are they doing in comparison with the other students? We have a high school that has 7 juniors, 7 African American juniors in their class. Not one of those 7 students is on track. To me, this is low-hanging fruit. Do you think those parents think their kids are not on track to graduate? How do we rally, whether it's 7 or whether it's 70 or whether it's 700? We have to understand the data. We have to look at dead in the eye and ask ourselves, why is it not happening? So policy, I think Carla said it, we have to love our kids, we have to love our community. And the smart thing to do is make sure that all of our children are literate, that they're capable, because they're gonna come back, or they're gonna sit, so you have choice. So the smart thing to do is make sure that we have identified all of our children who are in need, celebrate those who are doing an excellent job, and illuminate that. But we need to make sure that the education of all children, take the African Americans, second to special ed, they're the lowest performing in this nation. And no one really wants to talk about it. It's the elephant. If I were to ask you to raise your hand, how many of you who are school site people have a conversation around diversity and race on a weekly basis at your schools? Be honest. 1, 2. Look at the numbers, 3 or 4 people. And I ask that because that's not good enough. We have our heads in the sand. And if we think that we can't talk about race and diversity, and how do we become culturally responsive, and how do we create a culture, or say, I don't know why he's not doing anything, can you help me? Because the first thing to do is to acknowledge what you don't know so that you can find out.
There's one thing that keeps coming to mind as Angela was speaking, and I don't think we address it enough. I think hiring is extremely important. And we've all heard you have to get the right people on the bus. You really do. And it really is about making sure, first off, that you understand as a school leader, so we're talking about district and school level leaders, what is the mission of your organization? What are you all really trying to do? Not also for African American students, but for all students as a whole. If you really do believe all students can learn, and you have 7 students who aren't on track, then who are the people that you need to put on that bus that are gonna say, these 7 students, this is my pet project. As a counselor, this is what I'm gonna do to go above and beyond to make sure that they get what they need. So I think one piece that isn't addressed enough is making sure that you hire the right people to get the job done.
When you look around the United States, you see that most elected or appointed policymakers are white males. And the best thing I think that we can do is listen and learn. Listen and learn with the communities that we're asked to serve. Policymakers don't do that often. They like to talk a lot, and particularly when you're having to get reelected a lot, etc. As I reflect on my own experience, I've been so fortunate because I started out as a 7th grade teacher after I graduated from Loyola Marymount. And my first teaching assignment was in a school that was 100% African American here in South Los Angeles. And the community embraced me, and the community taught me so much. And I've had experiences of working in the Latino community and similar, very much so. But part of that for policymakers, and at the time I was a new teacher, not a policymaker, but is going in with a sense of respect, a sense of humility, and a sense of wanting to listen and learn authentically. Because if it's not authentic, people can figure it out. The second part of your question was, what's the role and responsibility of the community? And I think it is to absolutely not accept a broken down situation for their kids. And this is back to that tale of two cities. If I'm a parent, and I'm growing up in a part of town where a lot of things don't work, the local public school is not working, there's a huge gap, there's a lot of dropouts, there's a lot of kids not achieving. I don't want that for my child. And so sometimes policymakers look at these issues through the lens of a particular agenda. And I think that's what policymakers have to do. They have to let go of the agenda and say, what's really best for kids? And I'll give you a couple of examples. When you look at some issues that I want to acknowledge are very controversial issues, let's take the issue of vouchers. Let's take the issue of tax credits, and let's take the issue of the parent trigger law. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. Those pull very differently when you talk to parents from white affluent communities and you talk to parents from less privileged communities and parents of color. So in the African American community, for example, vouchers in California poll about 70% or so in the European American community saying, we don't think that's a good idea. 80% plus in the African American community saying, you're damn right we want vouchers. We want something different for our kids so that they can have the same chance that people have in other parts of this town. And if we think vouchers will help us get there, we don't really care about the political agendas that some folks have. We want what's best by our kids. And I can make that same distinction around things like the parent trigger law, etc. Again, not without controversy, but I think it's very interesting to see the data on how different communities look at these differently. I want all parents, but particularly parents of African American children and children who live in circumstances of poverty, to be the fiercest advocates possible and to say, I will not accept a broken down situation for my child, and I'll demand it from policymakers. That's what we need.
Thank you. So this is an opportunity for those of you in the audience to ask questions of our esteemed panel members who have a wealth of knowledge and experience. So there's a couple microphones there. You can come on up.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Valerie Santo. So I just went to Sacramento, so I'm super excited about this conversation, as I would be super excited at any other point in my life. But so Dr. Bass, you said a great school takes a great leader, and you also said, this is directed toward everyone, but you also said education should be policymakers' #1 issue, but it's not. So what I want to talk about was when I went to Sacramento, it's kind of simple, but it was really eye-opening for me. Because to change the conversation, one assembly member was like, well, who votes? So who votes? Because you said, Dr. Martin, you said they don't listen to their community, but they actually do, in my opinion. Yours are probably better. But probably back with more stats and info and education. But so in my opinion, they do listen to their community, but who goes out and votes? People who are over 65. So you get, instead of education reform, you get health reform, and you get things like health insurance for everyone, and that's the conversation. So I want to know if you think like engaging younger voters, or if that's where to change policy we need to start, to engage more voters so you get different elected officials, takes a great leader, and you change the conversation and they can listen to their community, because now their community is different and has a different conversation to talk about.
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have a political problem in California in the way that we draw our district boundaries and how all of that's been historically done, and we have more gerrymandering, so that there's a lot of safe districts where you're right, many electeds represent the will of their district. But if you look at policymakers more broadly, and you think of school site leaders and school district leaders as policymakers as well, because they are making school policies, I think there's an opportunity for them to be much, much more connected to the communities. You've got a lot of folks that are working as policy leaders in school sites, and they don't live in that community. So they don't necessarily know that community. So speaking broadly of it, I think you made a good point about electeds, but I think there's also an opportunity for a range of policymakers to look at this differently.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I'm happy for your comment, but if you look at the equity gap, like that to me is funding. Like, where are you going to get the funding for great teachers? The funding so you can have like wonderful people like you all up here to work at their schools. So that to me comes from the state level, with the grants, or the federal level. So that's when I say like we need to change the elected officials, because you can have all these great people in the schools on a local level, but on like a more federal level, you need to change like where the money's going and who it's going to.
Tell us your name, and also, are you a first-year teacher? What's your...
No. I just love politics, and hate it at some time. I think everyone does. But Valerie DeSanto, I'm a senior at Loyola Marymount University. I study political science, and Dr. Blakesley, my wonderful education policy teacher.
Do you have additional response to?
You know, I think there has to be another approach to the community. I do think that there needs to be a new strategy to go out and meet and speak with our community, because society, as a society, we haven't given the average person a reason to go vote. If you look at what people, the average, or even the underserved, or the low economic families, what reason have we given them to go out and vote? Because when they look around, they see things that are not happening for them. When the economic boom started to rise, guess what? Our lowest economic communities, they're still struggling. So, you know, it might look better for us in unemployment, but those at the bottom rung, you look at African American communities, they still have the highest unemployment rate. So I think there has to be a real consciousness that we need to find, not necessarily young, committed, but maybe young, people who are willing to come out and start going door to door. I think the strategy is to really communicate and give them the why. People don't know why they need to go out and vote, because so far, the story has been that it hasn't provided them. I want to respond to your question about money, because money in this nation, if we talk about all the trillions of dollars that have been spent on education and to look at the performance of our children, we should hang our heads in shame. Because, and money helps, so I'm not going to tell you that it doesn't, but it is the personal commitment for each individual, whether it's a homeowner, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a principal, whether it's the superintendent. How much do you really care? Are you putting your vision and your actions to practice? How are we holding ourselves? Not that we're going to, just saying, oh, teacher, we're going to evaluate you based on the performance of your kids. That is not enough. It's not enough. It has to be a personal commitment. So I do think there needs to be a new political strategy to go out and reach the masses, because there is a big chasm between those who have money and those who don't. And when you're sitting there and you can turn on the TV and see the world, it's not even. And people feel like, why should I go out there and vote? And then the other piece you have is you have a large number of African Americans and Latinos who have some type of crime. And we've created laws and policies that don't allow them to vote. So once you get out and you've done your time and you have, we don't have redemption. There are people who cannot vote today, and then some of the voting policies in the states are reverting back. So we need to have a bigger voice as a community around these things.
Thank you for that. Tell us again who you are, your name and your affiliation here. But also, can we keep our responses short, just because we only have 15 minutes and I want to get to all of them.
Thank you very much for having us. First of all, my name is Louis Alexander. I'm an employee of the city of Santa Monica. I'm a program specialist. I've been working there for about 20 years. I won't tell much of my age. I just wanted to mention, I am a native of Los Angeles. I'm a father now that has 3 daughters. And I grew up in LA along the 110 area, and I actually still live in that area and I'm proud about it. But what I wanted to talk about is I was one of those students in the 80s who was bused to the Valley. And my home school was, I went to LaSalle Elementary School right off of Manchester and Normandy, or off of Western. And my mom later on bused me in about 3rd, 4th grade to a school called Beckford Elementary School in the Valley. But what I saw that happened after years later is that a lot of the teachers and administrators didn't really know how to handle students from LA when we were that first, kind of cohort of kids who went to the Valley. And so we were kind of shunned, from the start, and I guess just to get to my question, is there a plan to even change the atmosphere of what schools look like in LA so kids feel more comfortable and feel as if they are walking into schools instead of walking into prisons like you mentioned before? And also, is there really education that is sticking with some of the administrators and policy holders to let them know that, first of all, it's a case-by-case basis with every student that steps into your school, but also to let them know that you almost have to wear 20 different hats to be able to deal with students or whatever, because you have so many different personalities coming in, and you have to be able to adjust, just like a coach would on the field or whatever the case may be. And a lot of teachers want to throw it out there that they don't have time because of the number of students that they have in their classrooms, but I beg to differ. I just wanted to mention also something that happened to me, and I think that this is the way about going about it. While going into schools, I went to a number of different schools, and I was suspended from some of them. I went to Holmes, I got kicked out of there. I went to Chatsworth, I got kicked out of there. I went to Taft for 6 months, I got kicked out of there. I graduated from Reseda. But through all of that, I just felt like when I was in junior high, after having a fight, and I remember the guy today, I'm still trying to find him, if anybody knows Mr. Cornett. But he did something so different for me after having a fight. He sent me to a camping trip with a bunch of students who actually earned it. And I didn't realize, and I was kind of wondering why he did that for me either. But he realized that this kid just needs a break. And so I just want to know that are people really, really looking at that side of it? And what these kids are going through, the neighbors they have to travel through, and all of that stuff like that. But really, 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 what is the root of how we can help this kid get wherever he needs to be? And are those things that are being talked about in some of these meetings? And if not, can somebody please make a suggestion?
Well, I'll want to respond to that. So I want to first say, and this is not because of where I am literally currently sitting, but I think a lot of the things that you're talking about in terms of are those conversations being had, they're being had right here. So if I were to say one thing about how we can broaden that, I think more schools of education need to do what LMU is doing. Because the education that I got here in the administrative credentialing program, that's why I came back for the EDD. It was life-changing. And I already had my own personal experience, but it just expounded on it even more. So those conversations are happening here. They're happening here in the classrooms. They're happening here after classes when we go out to talk about the things that we learned in class. So they're definitely happening. Now, are they happening on a larger scale at school sites? It depends on the school site. It really does depend on the school site. So, yeah.
I think wherever you are, you need to ask those exact questions. Those were brilliant questions. They were brilliant examples of how we have neglected to care for all of our children and see them all with the gifts. This teacher, Mr. Conrad?
Mr. Cornett.
Cornett saw something in you, thank God, and he gave you an opportunity. And so I think we need to give more young people opportunities, because sometimes our actions don't match our brain, don't match our capacity to be brilliant. And so, thank goodness for him.
Over here? Good. All right.
You can tell us your name and,
Okay. My name is Christian Goody. I'm a communication studies here at Loyola, Marymount. This is my wonderful teacher right here, Dr. Deanna Cook. So my question, or something I want to ask is, so present-day media illustrates successful Black professions as being either athletes, entertainers, and unfortunately drug dealers as well. You see this all over media, present day. And for students who are from areas of poverty, socioeconomic depression, who see these professions as being so close and so common to them, and that are in these schools where they're learning about things that are unfamiliar to them, they often see this as an outlet to for them to not be in school, for them to drop out, which leads to the prison system pipeline, where it's, I could be playing basketball, investing my time in, rapping or, doing something other than school, which is, basically talking about things that I'm familiar with, like I said. So to those students, and also to add, white students, they're portrayed in media as the congressmen, the policymakers, as you talked about, the lawyers, presidents. So there's a familiarity and commonality in the classroom when learning about these discussions. They're more intrigued while the African American students are kind of disengaged. And, middle school, especially high school, we don't learn about things such as how to pay taxes or how to own homes, things that really prepare us for when we're out of school. We'd rather learn things as, American history, which is often very objective, nobody knows the truth. So, what is something that schools could do or are doing to kind of, fix this or, help this retention rate?
That's a terrific question, and I think it goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier, which is culturally responsive education, culturally responsive pedagogy. So we can't take it for granted that the right curriculum, the right images, the right information about African American role models will be in the curriculum. And teachers are going to have to pick this up and do some extra work. Part of that is going to be changing the narrative. And so you described a narrative where the media portrays successful African Americans as athletes or entertainers or in some cases drug addicts. So, that's a very, very narrow way to look at a whole community. Teachers have to mix that up. And a lot of times it's taking the extra time to bring things into the curriculum, to bring in speakers, to bring in role models. There's all kinds of things that can happen. But if you don't have the belief system, you can't do it. And so, several people have complimented the LMU School of Education. One of the things I'm really proud about is that in our teacher credentialing programs, our administrative programs, this is embedded so that folks learn the strategies and the techniques of how to be more culturally responsive and how to change that narrative so it's not the only thing. And it's not happening everywhere. In fact, like I said, I'd like to be an optimist and think it's getting better. It's something we have to face and address every single day.
Just really quickly, so one thing that we do at our school, we look at the curriculum. So you talked about learning how to buy a home, those kind of things. We have a financial literacy class because it's important for students to know how to balance a checkbook, how to do taxes, all of those kind of things. So we do that. We also, because we're a medical science focus, we weekly have speaker series with different doctors and other people from the medical profession, and we purposely find people who look like our students, so that they have in front of them examples of other people that are successful that look exactly like them.
And just briefly, we've got to present within the curriculum the history. So there are great doctors, there are great lawyers. There's Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest orators of our country. Well, our children, if you ask them they might know Martin Luther King, but do they know who Frederick Douglass is? So we've got to stretch and broaden and do our own homework and bring those these culturally responsive curriculum into the classroom. And I think the mentoring piece is gigantic. I think we underestimate what we can do when we bring a few people. We do 30 minutes twice a month. And what we've seen is we're sending young people to college. They have a sense of agency. They have a sense of knowing who they are. We're taking what Shane talked about is that grit that they already come with. They know how to make a way out of nowhere. So how do you transfer that to what they need to learn in school
and give them a reason why they should know the history aspect. Does that make sense? So they need to know why. Why do you need to know about, early civilization? Well, if you get the whole story, then you'll see civilization from many perspectives. So I think we have to be purposeful and conscious about what we're doing.
Thank you. And you already are role modeling just by being here.
Appreciate
The
it.
next
Thank you.
generation, yeah. Darren's going to close out, so let's take another question over here.
Hi, my name is Gina Frazier, and I'm a member of the Committee for Racial Justice. And we started about 4 years ago after an event that happened at Santa Monica High School where an African-American student was tied or chained to a locker and racial things were said to him. But we went to the school board to let them know that this was a racist incident, and they've never really came out and said that this was a racist incident. We've also have been talking to, feels like I'm so close, but we've also been talking with the school district, the superintendents, the board members, talking about the fact that there is an achievement gap at the school. My question to you is, after you meet with the superintendent, the school board, the mayor, everybody, and you've been meeting with them for 4 years and talking about the achievement gap, and nothing is being done, where would you go? What is your next move? And I would like to say that, let's say it's a school of over 3,000, maybe a little more than 300 are African American students, and maybe 10% of them are proficient in math and English.
I honestly believe you have to, as Dolores Huerta says, get off the sidewalk and get in the streets. And I think you've got to make a physical presence. We must stop sitting in silence. We are killing our children when we see atrocities happening and we don't speak out. I sat in a meeting yesterday with the board member. Our children in San Diego are failing. So we've got to speak up and speak out, and they shouldn't just look like me. This is not a black people issue, people. This is a nationwide issue, and it's the smart thing to do to make sure all of our children are educated well. So I know that you probably are marking, but I think there needs to be a visible presence and use the media, social media to bring attention to this. But have your facts. I mean, we have to have our facts and not, yes, it's emotional, but this is factual. This is really factual, and I say we have to get in the streets and begin to protest the mistreatment and the miseducation of African American children.
Thank you.
Last question here. Make it good.
Hello, my name is Khalil. I'm a new addition to the Ed.D program, and I want to bring in an experience. I used to teach, do Regents test prep in New York City for the global history Regents, and it would be 8 weeks leading up to the test at the end of the year. And I had a group of students, 21 students. They're all retaking the test. Some 2-3 times. This test has a 54% fail rate, right? And they needed to graduate. So I have a student who have students who are accepted to college, but they need this test to graduate. They've gone to prom already. And I want to just hone in right on the actual curriculum. And my students have an intrinsic understanding that the curriculum is hostile to them and to them as a people, right? So we have a question on the test that asks, what hindered European colonialism in Africa? And 2/3 of my students chose widespread unified resistance. And that was the wrong answer. The correct answer is geographic barriers, which only 3 of my students chose. And another question asked about what led to the collapse of the Aztecs. And that 2/3 again of my students chose a lack of military training. And again, wrong answer. The correct answer was Spanish conquerors, right? So there's a worldview that is coded into the test, and it's really heinous and nefarious to kind of ask a young person to distinguish between widespread unified resistance and maybe, yes, there were resistance, but it wasn't both widespread and unified, and you need to do that to be able to pass the test and get out of high school. So, how are we like getting to the actual how these things are being taught? That's very good.
You made it very good.
There is an unfortunate, heinous, as you said, legacy of this kind of thing in the United States educational system. And it's still with us today. And so I think that the examples you gave, and there's many, many other examples of asking children who've never seen snow to, the right question, you have to understand all that. And so I think that what you're highlighting and bringing to light here connects with the question of the previous speaker about what do we do about this, and we simply cannot accept it. I mean, the bigger issue that you raise is the role of these high-stakes tests in determining the future of all of our children, but particularly children who historically don't do well because they don't have the equipment, if you will, to succeed on this. So these tests end up being sorting mechanisms for future track, and we need to look at them for what they are. Right, we talked about examples of institutional racism. And so I think that we certainly need to push for more authentic ways to say, how can our children really demonstrate what they know and they're able to do? And this is part of policy. Ref and I sit on the state commission. Ultimately that commission approves the tests that educators will take to demonstrate competencies. And so I think there's a way in the public discourse where these things can get challenged, but it's not easy. You've got to actually bring it to light and protest these things.
I would just say I think it's also important as I look out at a sea of faces, some of whom I'm hoping are going to go into education, if you're not already there. If we look at the long game and we think about the people who are making the policy and the people who are making the test, that needs to be shifted. And the way to shift it is to start in the classrooms that we have now so that our students then become the people who are making the policies and writing the tests. So every little bit that you do today is going to get our students there so that if that question is even an option, they know how to reword it, so forth and so on, but they have to be sitting in the room to do that. And so there's work that we need to do now, and it's a long game. It's going to take a little bit of time. But if we do our job well, then we won't be having the same conversation 10, 15, 20 years from now.
I want to recommend a book because I think as educators, we all must continue to be scholars. We must continue to study what we don't know and really take a look and have group conversations. And this is a book that actually was funny. I had met Dr. Asa Hilliard years ago, and I loved his work. He passed away a few years ago. He's done a lot of research and studying the history of African people and African American people. And as I was looking on for more of his work, this book is called Young, Gifted, and Black, Promoting the High Achievement of African American Students, and it's by 3 scholars. So there are 3 different scholars, and they have 3 opinions. They're not all congruent, so you're not going to get, what do you call it, mind think, where everybody's thinking the same. But they give you 3 really rich perspectives on the issue about African American children. What did it look like from the very beginning? What's the philosophy of African people? Because we carry on many practices that we don't know that were brought to us generations and generations. So I hope that you all are scholars and you take a moment. It's a very fast read, very rich reading, and I think it will change everybody's perspective. As an African American woman, it gave me a more rich study, and I think as teachers of different ethnicities, it's our responsibility to know about who our children. Even if you have one African American child, you need to know something about him or her. You need to go to that home, or you need to drive the community. What does your child do? How does he get to school? What's in his community? And I think it's our responsibility as educators to do that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Darren in a second before I plug something for myself. You gave me the microphone. You gotta say something. I want to thank the three of you for the conversation, for your salient points, and also for the questions that came from the audience. Some of you know that I'm running for LAUSD School Board, obviously a policy platform, right? And I learned so much today. But the thing that I've taken away with me tonight is a statement, and I don't think it was specifically said this way, but certainly this is what I took from the conversation, is we've got to start by seeing the humanity in the face of every one of our children, right? So policy isn't just about rules, regulations, it's about seeing the face of humanity of our children. So I want us to continue the conversation outside of these doors in the reception, but also I want to make sure that when someone asks the question, how many of you talk about race on a weekly basis, that more hands are up, because we're courageous enough to talk about that elephant in the room. So I'll turn it back over to Karen.
But our panel was so excellent, they answered it, so I'm okay. Before we started, I mentioned to Dr. McCullough and also mentioned to Dr. Rodriguez, and it was a term that I learned from my 21-year-old son probably about a month ago. I said, make it fire. This was fire, folks. Show some more love. Myself and Dr. Bickett, when we sat around and we just kind of imagined what this year would look like as we talked about African American students and the various different aspects of their being educated in a system that is sometimes hostile towards them, we never imagined that we would get the kind of, first, a response from those who continue to come out, but also just to kind of generate the conversation and the energy. And so with that, I just, I thank you guys for coming out tonight, but we need feedback. So there's a survey that will be coming to all of you who either registered online or came with your classes or whatever. There's a survey that will be coming out. Please fill it out so that it will inform where we're going with the rest of our community dialogues as we move forward. You see an empty seat here. This is an empty seat that is kind of indicative of what's happening in terms of a larger district and conversations. This is a seat for one of my dear friends who is also the Educational Service Center West Superintendent, Cheryl Hildreth. But Cheryl is currently, or was currently this evening, in meetings with Superintendent Cortinez about issues around education. So she was unable to make it, but she sends her greetings and she apologizes for not being able to be here. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Martin, Dr. McCullough, Dr. Bass, and Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you very much. And then the last thing is just this. We have talked so much about where do we go. And we've had a lot of conversations, Dr. Bickett, Deanna, myself, kind of what does it look like moving forward. So we just want to kind of prep you. Our conversations next year will focus on, and as a dad, my friend, I don't remember your name, but you said you had 3 daughters?
Yes, sir.
I'm a dad of 5 with 4 daughters, so I totally can relate. And so our conversation next year will appeal to both you and I and everyone else in the room. We'll be having conversations about women and girls. That's going to be our theme for next year. So as we move forward, we're excited. We ask you to spend some time with us out in our reception. Our panelists, our moderator will be out there to answer more questions.